As far as coaching questions, my fundamental question, I think, for a lot of this stuff is, what am I making this mean? And what else could it mean? Because as humans, we are meaning-making machines. We make meaning out of everything. And how we make that meaning is really important. We could go back to, my client and the marble jar, right? The fact would be she was, she had 21 days sober, then she drank. Then she had 42 days, then she drank. Then she had 3 days and she drank. That's the fact. Everything after that is meaning. And she could make the meaning be, I'll never get better. See, I'm broken. It's not going to work. Or, gosh, that's a lot of progress. I'm really doing well. I bet I can do better. That's very simple. But we make meaning out of everything all of the time. And so, what am I making this mean and what else could it mean? And then there's a corollary question to that, which I think is often important, which is, what would be the most useful meaning or interpretation, right? Because they're not neither of those things. If she says I can't seem to stay sober, or there's that's true, as well as she's making progress. Both those things are true, but the one that paints it as progress is a far more useful framing of that. And so I think that those three questions sort of stacked is a way of approaching both behavior change, but also just everything in our lives, every situation. What am I making this mean?
I think those three questions are just really valuable. What am I making this mean? What else could it mean? And what's the most useful meaning I could give this situation? Like that's powerful. Okay, Eric, welcome to the show. It's great to be speaking with you again.
It's lovely to be talking with you. I love your accent. It just makes me happy to talk to you because of your accent and just in general. So thank you.
Well, I appreciate that. So you're at the latter stages of finishing off your book. What would you say the central thesis of your book is, if you had to narrow it down?
I think the core idea is that when we think about making change in our lives, whether that is external changes or it is internal changes to how we think and feel, we tend to focus on one or the other of those things. And reality, lasting change means we have to change both our behavior and our thought patterns. We have to work on both simultaneously, and they really influence and affect each other. And then the second core idea is not new, but it's that little by little, a little becomes a lot. And that's how we change things. For the vast majority of us, that's how most of our change is going to happen. And while we hear cliches like slow and steady wins the race, we don't, by and large, really buy into or accept this idea because we get frustrated when we're not seeing results as quickly as we want and we give up. And so it's partially about trying to get people to really embrace and buy into that idea so that there is an opportunity to change, because I do believe we can all change in positive ways, but it's not easy and it generally takes time.
For sure, for sure. Well, that's a really important subject. And yeah, I'm totally with you there that for lasting change to happen, you have to target both the inner and the outer, and also this little by little approach. How have you applied what you know? Because you've spent probably decades now studying the science of behavior change and applying it. How have you applied this to actually help you write the book, would you say?
Well, it's interesting because writing the book has been the most significant challenge I have faced in easily a decade, both from how much work it was, so the external part of sitting down and writing, and the internal side about the amount of self-doubt that it generated in me. And so the book literally has been written 30 minutes at a time, because trying to take on more than 30 minutes at a time in my mind always felt overwhelming. And so I might have 3 or 4 hours allocated to writing. But if I let myself get into that mindset, it is hard for me. So I just literally would set a timer for 30 minutes, start a playlist that I have, and all my attention was just stay in it for 30 minutes. Don't bail out in this 30-minute window, which is, of course, what we want to do. I'm sitting there writing and I'm stuck and nothing is coming out, or I write 2 sentences and they're absolute garbage. And my brain starts saying, see, I know you couldn't do this, right? You're not good enough to do this. And all of a sudden, what we want to do is get out of there, right? That's what I want to do. I want to launch solitaire in another web browser and just escape for a little bit. So for me, the discipline was 30 minutes at a time. And it was also about measuring myself by effort, because it was the only thing I could control. I had no idea how many words I could write a day. I had no idea how long it would take me to write a good chapter. I just didn't know any of that. What I did know was I have allocated an X amount of time to do this. Am I sticking in there and doing my best in that time? And if I am, I'm going to celebrate that and I'm going to say, great, you did a great job. Because anything other than that, that's a whole lot bigger than that, starts to get real overwhelming.
For sure. There's so much wisdom in there. It reminds me a little bit of Stephen Pressfield. He's like, his metric is like, as long as I've shown up for the 3 or 4 hours today and I've given my best, that's the only thing I can control. And if I've done that, I'm satisfied. And I like even better this idea of breaking that down into 30-minute chunks. And that's all you need to do is get through that 30 minutes and then you're done.
Exactly. And once the 30 minutes is done, I'm like, all right, great job. I take a small break and then I hit it again, right? But just knowing that all I have to do is hang in there with those uncomfortable feelings or that doubt or that difficulty for 24 more minutes or 18 more minutes or 9 more minutes, depending where I am, is for me really helpful.
What are your thoughts on the link between creativity and spirituality? When you sit down to do these things, often something happens. It's not quite, maybe not quite you, but there's something there that, yeah. Does that make any sense? What I'm trying to get at there?
It does. I actually did a workshop at a Columbus event called Creative Mornings. It's like creative professionals get together once a month and somebody speaks. And my topic was spirituality and creativity.
Hmm.
And I think that at the most basic nature, for me, if I look at spirituality as being trying to connect with or see the true nature of reality, that's kind of what it means to me. When I look at reality, one of the things it seems to fundamentally be is creative, right? The number of life forms is exquisite and amazing and immense. It's life just keeps churning out new things. And so that is sort of a fundamental belief. And I do know that in the moments I've been most creative or done my best work, whether that's in songwriting or improvising a guitar solo or coming up with an idea for a program, there is a little bit of a sense of me not being there.
Hmm.
And I, I guess the best way I would say this is spirituality for me has also been to a large degree about decentering my ego from the way that I view the world and respond to the world. And when I do that, I actually am able to be more creative, because I think the thing that blocks us in creativity an awful lot is us thinking about ourselves and how well we're doing and whether we're able to do this and is it good enough and is it measure up, and all of that to me is a break on creativity. And when I'm able to find myself into a place where there's less of that happening, then creativity happens a little bit more naturally and easily.
For sure, for sure. Well, it reminds me of a couple of things. So I was listening to, there's a great conversation on your podcast, the one you feed with a man, I think he's called Matthew Fox, and he speaks a lot about this as well. You guys have had a conversation on this subject. But also, I've heard you say that being relieved of bondage to self, whenever you heard this had a big impact on your thinking. Can you maybe tell us about the significance of this phrase to you?
Sure. I mean, it comes out of an idea that phrase comes directly out of something in 12-step literature. But there's a core idea in what was the AA Big Book, still is the AA Big Book, that sort of said selfishness, self-centeredness, that we think is the root of our problem. And the problem they're talking about there is alcoholism. And I was an alcoholic, a homeless heroin addict. So I had all that in spades. And that idea really turned on the lights for me, that showed me that whether I was thinking highly of myself or I was thinking that I was a total, piece of shit, whatever, I was thinking about myself all the time. And I realized then that most of the suffering in my life comes about by an intense myopia on me. And so to be relieved of the bondage of self is simply for that just to lessen a little bit and fade away. And I think a lot about perspective. And I think that, there's a phrase, making mountains out of molehills, right? And the way you make a molehill into a mountain is you lay down right next to it and you look at it really, really closely and it looks really big. And that's what happens to me when I'm in the bondage of self, or other people I know, is that little things start to look really big because our perspective is so narrow and myopic. And that when we can sort of zoom out in any way, perspective wise, then that changes. And one of the ways to zoom out for me, perspective wise, is to realize that there's a whole lot of other things in the world and people in the world that are not me, that I am not indeed the center of the world. Now, I'm the center of my world, and that's natural and normal and human. And it can start to become a little bit of a prison.
Yeah, so to me, that's fascinating, and it just makes so much sense. But there seems to be a direct correlation with the amount we're focusing on ourselves and the amount we're suffering. So if you want to sort of suffer less, it's quite obvious that maybe focus on yourself less. And um,
This is challenging. I'll add a little bit, because the type of work that you do and that I do is, let's just broadly call it personal development work, right? Um, or well, let's just leave it at that for right now. Does cause a certain amount of introspection to need to happen, a certain amount of focus on ourselves, right? So it's this very tricky balance of, I need to be introspective enough and I need to spend time by myself and I need to spend time in solitude, connecting with myself. That's part of this process. And at the same time, if that's all that I have, then I run the danger of becoming, very just lost in myself and stuck in myself.
yeah, there's a tension there for sure, and you have to account for both. I've heard you say as well, Eric, that reducing suffering is a core value for you. It's quite high up in, say, your value hierarchy. Why is this so important, and why is this something that anybody listening to this should maybe take into consideration, would you say?
Well, I would not say that my value structure needs to be anybody else's. So I would probably stop short of saying this needs to be a value of other people. However, as someone who suffered greatly, right, you don't become a homeless heroin addict at 24 if you're well adapted to the world, right? That comes about from a lot of mental and emotional suffering. And so, having been there and also, wrestled with depression throughout my life, I have a empathy for what that's like. And I think that I also have an ability to help in that area in that way. There's lots of kinds of suffering in the world. My lane seems to be mental and emotional suffering, but there's a ton of it. It's endemic to the human condition. And so if we can lessen that, then I think that's a good thing. And to me, it's a value, right? It's something that's important that I feel like I can do better than I can do lots of other things. And I know what it feels like to suffer. And it's lovely that my work can be oriented on helping people to do that less.
For sure, for sure. Now, as you've mentioned a few times there, you have a pretty remarkable background. 24, weighed 100 pounds, homeless, addicted to heroin, and you turned things around. And you've been on quite a trajectory since. Is there anything, when you were at those lowest moments, is there anything that you really needed to hear or would have been really helpful for you to hear in that dark place that you think could have helped you to sort of shift things more effectively?
I don't know. I feel very fortunate because I obviously heard what I needed to hear to be where I am, right? So I heard whatever was important for me. The thing that I always say to people who are in that type of circumstance is to keep trying, right? Keep trying, because getting sober at that point for me was a result of many other tries that didn't work. Right? That was not my first time going into inpatient treatment. It was not my first time to try and remedy this problem. I had been trying to remedy this problem a lot of different ways for a number of years. And all those efforts were important. But if I had judged my ability to get better based on those earlier efforts and their failure, I wouldn't have kept trying. And there was a very dark period between right before I actually did get sober, where I started to believe I couldn't get better. And that was a dangerous place to be in. It was a dangerous place to think this is the way I'm always going to be. And so we talk a lot about consequences when we think about people who are in addiction. And consequences are a big driver of why we change anything, right? If you are trying to eat more healthily and you think you have a problem with eating, right? It could be your poor health that's the consequence that you're trying to avoid, that's pushing you towards doing something. But consequences are not sufficient. They're necessary, I think, but they're not sufficient, because at the same time that sort of recognition of just how bad things are, hope needs to arise right next to it. And so I got both of those. I got a very clear understanding of just how bad my situation was, and I got enough hope at the same moment. And so I think a lot of people who are out there who have tried to make changes, and again, we could be talking about serious addiction down to smaller things. The important thing that I think is keep trying. We used to say in 12-step programs, you end the meeting by saying, keep coming back. Everybody says that. I don't think that for me means keep coming back to necessarily to 12-step meetings. I broaden it to mean keep coming back to the belief and the hope that you are capable of making a change and that it's possible. That, I think, is the important thing, is to keep trying.
Definitely, definitely. So for me, whenever I think about addiction, one of the things that comes to mind is this idea that it seems to be, like Andrew Huberman describes it, as a progressive narrowing of what you can get pleasure from. So it seems that the further you descend the addiction ladder, the narrower your choices become. And the further you get out of it, the wider they become. And you tell a story where I think this is recent enough, but you went to the pharmacy or the chemist for your mother, and you were picking up some narcotics for her, some like painkillers, or whatever, and you had no temptation. Whereas if that had been your former self, it would have been like, like, oh my god, like, So, what are your thoughts on choice, Eric, and the extent to which we can grow that capacity?
Yeah. I love that idea of narrowing of uh, things that can give you pleasure, because that's absolutely true, right? By the end, for me, there was only one thing I wanted, and it was heroin. And I would burn everything else in life down to get that. Today, there's like one thing I can't do, right? Like I can't take mind altering substances. The rest of the world is now available to me. So from a pleasure perspective, that is absolutely true. And the choice perspective is also a really good one, because I think that we tend to frame a lot of things in binaries, and addiction, I think, gets framed in often in a binary sense. There's the old sense that has been all through time, which is it's basically a character failing or a moral failing, right? You just need to not do it.
Yeah.
And then in the last 70 years, more of a what's known as a disease model of addiction has emerged. And the disease model basically says your brain has been hijacked by these things, and you have no real choice in the matter. And both of those, I think, are false, because there's an element of each in there. Absolutely. When and the story you're telling, I tell in context of, yeah, a couple years ago, I realized I was driving narcotics from a pharmacy to my mother's, and I wasn't even thinking of it. And once upon a time, I would have robbed you at gunpoint for that, probably, right? And so my degree of choice is completely different in regards to that substance than it was. So it's true that as an addict, my my choice window was much narrower. And yet there was still some in there, right? There was still some agency that caused me to, you know, do the things that I did to get sober. And so I think that this idea of self-control, let's call it that generally, is a really interesting one, because I do think we have differing degrees of self-control. People have differing degrees. And, how do you talk about that you may be in a situation where you have less self-control without giving away your belief in your ability to change? And I think that it's useful to this point. I think it's useful to think about this lessening of self-control to understand why you're struggling in the way that you're struggling. Because if you do think it's a character failing or a moral failing, then shame comes in, and shame is a driver of addiction, and you're not going to get better. Right. So I do think there is something to recognizing, yeah, my ability to control this has been severely curtailed. And that's why this is so hard for me. But I have to leave enough opening there that I can act, that there's a way to change it. And that change is going to have to come from me. It's going to have to originate in me. There's a certain base level of, I'm not going to do drugs today, that has to be in there. Now, in the beginning, I would say it was like barely 50.6% versus 49.4% or whatever, to do it versus not do it. And that was enough, with significant help from other people, to care. I mean, I think I got to 50% or 51% with a lot of help, but it was enough. And now it's more like 99 point, my desire to use is extraordinarily infrequent and minor and passing. So the ratio of my sort of choice has changed, but there was always some in it, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
It's fascinating, and it makes me think that just a general thing to aim for in life is to be always kind of moving towards widening that choice window, so you're less dependent on specific things, specific attachments for your pleasure and your happiness, you know?
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful way to say it. And, I know you've done a lot of work around trauma, right? And I think that's one of the most important things about healing trauma, is that it widens your option window, right? Trauma and fear in general shrinks your life. You avoid more and more. because you don't want to be re-traumatized or triggered or use whatever word you want. Your life shrinks. And as we heal, ideally our life expands. And in the way that you said, I think it's our options expand. I'm able to do more. The less fear I have, the more bravery I'm going to have to try different things. It's why avoidance is such a disastrous strategy for nearly everything. Because if you avoid it, you reinforce it. You make it more, you become more afraid of it.
Definitely, definitely. So I want to start maybe talking now about some of your thoughts around coaching, Eric. And you, I'm very grateful for this, by the way. But you introduced me to AJ Jacobs, who's a friend of yours, and I've interviewed him a couple of times since, and he's just an amazing character. But what a big focus of AJ's thinking and work is around puzzles, and you like to approach coaching from a kind of like the frame of as a puzzle as opposed to a problem to be fixed. Can you just tell us a little bit about your thinking around power of this frame?
Yeah. AJ certainly put a catchier term on, although I don't know that he got it. I think he got it from Quincy Jones. Um, a catchier piece, like, think of, puzzles, not problems. So he's more succinct. He's a great writer. He's just good at that. Uh, I would have taken, 100 words to articulate that thing. But the core of it is this: when people hire someone like me, and I described myself for a long time as a behavior coach, because what I primarily was going to help you do was to behave differently in the world. And getting over an addiction is essentially, getting a behavior. And what I realized is that when people come in thinking that there's something fundamentally wrong with them, it's very hard to change. Right? It could be someone like me who thinks, once an addict, always an addict. I'm broken. There's something. But it could be somebody else who's just like, you know what? I never stick with anything. I'm the kind of person who never sticks with anything. It's that line right there. I'm the kind of person who. And when we look at change in a behavior through that lens, it's very difficult to actually change, because change at its heart is a learning process. And shame and self-judgment, it blocks learning, right? I could spend 10 minutes, 20 minutes talking about that, but let's just accept that that's largely true, and I'll elaborate if you want. It blocks learning. So what I would say to people is, okay, we haven't figured out how to get you exercising on a regular basis yet. We haven't figured out all the pieces of a puzzle, but that's what this is. Right? It's a puzzle. And that's what modern behavior change science has shown us. There's a lot of different things that go into our ability to change a behavior. And we have to sort of adjust the dial on a lot of those different things so that we find the formula that works for you. And by treating it as a puzzle, I'm able to approach setbacks as more data versus I'm a failure. Like there's something wrong with me. Instead of it being a thing that tells me, oh yeah, that just more confirms that I'm the kind of person who. I look at it as more data that allows me to go, oh, okay, well, that puzzle doesn't fit together quite in the way I thought. So what way does it fit together? And it allows you to keep doing what I said earlier, to keep coming back, because you keep coming back because you're like, okay, there's a solution here. And it's not about me having to be fundamentally different. It's about me having to arrange things on the outside of my life and on the inside, how I think about and view things. I have to arrange them in a certain way. But there is a solution.
Yeah, I love this, and I think the basic frame of viewing thing or viewing the situation as a puzzle as opposed to a problem, what it leads to is curiosity as opposed to the shame. And I've interviewed a woman, Janina Fisher, who's really big in trauma, and she says the exact same thing. Like if she's working with a client that has an addiction, her whole thing is like getting them curious about the behavior. Because what she says, she says, like if you look at the neuroscience, when someone's entering a state of curiosity, you're actually you're actually more in the prefrontal cortex, and you sort of exit these sort of older, more emotional parts of the brain, and that is really helpful for changing behavior, you know.
Yep.
And then what you're saying there too is about moving, and this is from you, this isn't me, but you're saying it's about switching from like having this is my identity to this is a tendency. And then whenever it's a tendency as opposed to an identity, you're sort of more in control too.
And I used that exact word with coaching clients, tendency, right? Because it's not, we don't want our identity to be, I'm the kind of person that doesn't stick with things. Let's just use a more common example without the extremes of addiction. We don't want that to be your identity. And at the same time, that may be a relatively true statement about your behavior up till now, is that you tend to not stick with things. So to pretend, like to just throw that away, we don't want to throw that away, because we want to account for and counteract your tendencies. Knowing your tendencies is really helpful, because you can then go, okay, well, I tend to do this. So when I do that, this is what I'm going to do. So it's this fine line of, I don't want to make it an identity, but I also can't ignore that this is a tendency. And so that's a word that I landed on that I really like, because I think it speaks to what we're talking about. I tend to do this. Now, in addiction, your tendency is like, your tendency is like turned up to a 10. you know but it's still, you could say, I tend to do this because I don't. It's clear millions of people get over addictions. It wasn't baked into who they were. It seemed like it was their identity, but it was a behavioral pattern, and behavioral patterns can change.
For sure, for sure. And this links well with another thing that is like super important. So in the notes you sent over, a phrase that really jumped out was self kindness is the foundation of growth. And you talk about sort of being on your own side. What are you kind of getting at here, Eric?
Well, that phrase, being on your own side, I got from Dr. Aziz Gazipura, who has been on the podcast a couple of times, and he wrote a book called Be on Your Own Side, which is the book is essentially very similar territory to what Kristen Neff is at with self-compassion. They're very similar things. I just love that phrase, be on your own side. And it is similar to what we are talking about here, which is that when we are not kind to ourselves, when we are in judgment of ourselves, we are doing exactly what you just referenced with the woman who talks about trauma. We are shifting our brain into more of an emotional limbic reactionary place. Right? Think about, if I come at you right now, if I were to be like, hey, you are an absolute jerk and you suck as an interviewer and everything you're doing is a waste of time, it's stupid, you would immediately get defensive and you would start to get emotional, and you might then react in a way that's not the best version of you, right? We do that to ourselves, though, right? We talk to ourselves like that all the time. And we are essentially triggering our own defensiveness and emotional intensity, which is then taking, again, as we said, sort of energy away from, I'm speaking not in a strict neuroscience sense, but in a general sense, we're taking energy away from our prefrontal cortex. And if we accept that change in a behavior is fundamentally about learning how to do something different, you have to be in your prefrontal cortex. You have to be thinking. You have to be examining data, and self-criticism shuts that down. Adyashanti once said something to me that was along the lines of, nothing shuts down consciousness as fast as self-judgment.
Wow.
And so, Dr. Gazipura, Kristen Neff, Adyashanti, trauma researchers, we're all saying a very similar thing here, which is, to change, you have to be in a more open, curious, non-reactive place. And self-criticism is one of the ways, very harsh self-criticism is one of the ways that we move ourselves out of that curious, open, non-defensive place.
And how do you, like, say you're working with a client and they have a really intense inner critic that's just kicking their ass? Like, how do you help that person better work with that?
Well, I don't think that the same things work for everybody, but the first step is to become more aware and cognizant of that voice and that it's happening. Because we all have this curious tendency to be completely lost in a thought pattern and also completely unaware of it at the same time. It's just bizarre, but it is the way we function. And so the first step is just to realize, like, oh, there it is again. There it is again. There it is again, which is initially often very uncomfortable because you're like, oh my God, like this is what's going on in my head all the time, right? So the first stage of that is often a very uncomfortable one, but we have to start to recognize it. And then different people respond in different ways. I think the simplest approach, and I think I probably took this straight from Kristen Neff, but I'm going to add a little something to it, is to be a friend to yourself. And what I mean by that is you think about what you would say and how you would respond to a friend who is having the same difficulty. But this is an imaginative exercise. And what I mean by that is you actually have to really imagine it. There's something known as Ethan Kross from the University of Michigan was one of the researchers who coined this term called Solomon's paradox. Solomon's paradox is based on King Solomon, who was widely considered one of the wisest people in the world, and yet his own life was kind of a disaster area, right? So Solomon's wisdom is, I could be really wise to you, but I have a very difficult time applying the same thing to me. So this imaginative exercise of imagining what I would say to a friend and how I'd respond to them is one way around that. The other thing is it allows us to find the words that we would use. A lot of self-compassion language is very touchy-feely. And for a lot of people, they're going to cringe at it. By thinking of how I would support a friend or how I would support, you can also think of like a child, allows me to get in touch with the words that work for me. And then the other thing that I think can be really important is we often try and go from a really negative self-critic. We're encouraged to look in the mirror and say, you're awesome, you're amazing, you're great. And that, to me, usually doesn't work because I don't believe it. So I'll give you an example about the book. If I had tried to say to myself when I doubted myself, Eric, you're a great writer. You're amazing. You're just as good as name your top 5 writers. I would never have believed that. It would have been a waste of my time and energy. So what I often aim for and encourage people to aim for is can you just get neutral? Can you just get to neutral? And so for me, what that looked like was we know that if you keep trying, you're going to get better. And we don't know how much better you can get. So that is a statement that feels really true, that also allows me to drop all that negative baggage a little bit. The other thing about a really negative inner critic or any negative thought pattern is they take a long time to unwind, right? This is the unfortunate news, right? You're younger than me, so it's going to be a little easier for you. And it would be a little easier for my son, who's 26, and it would be a little easier for a 10-year-old. But I've had some of these patterns, or people who are my age have had some of these patterns running since they were like 5. It's a long time for your brain to sort of really get locked into something. So the good news is you can change them. The bad news is it takes a while. And in order to do it, I think that you need a system of thought retraining that allows you to do it often enough that over time it can change. So not easy to change an inner critic. Those are some of my thoughts on it.
So interesting. And so we're talking here about interchange, and your book covers both inner and outer. So let's maybe shift gears now to exploring some approaches to sort of structural and environmental changes, particularly when we're targeting behaviors. So, like, if a client comes to you and they're trying to change a behavior, let's use the example of they want to take on a new habit of exercising, or they want to, yeah, take your pick, exercising, writing, healthy eating, whatever. How do you think about helping them to set up their environment in a way that removes willpower from the equation as much as possible?
Yeah. And I think if you were to gather all the leading behavior change scientists in one room and ask them to agree on something, I think what they would all agree on is the more of that environmental stuff you do, the better off you are, right? You don't want to rely on self-control to or willpower. However, you do have, I mean, that is an element. That does need addressed. And so when I think about change in behavior, I'm looking at, I call it structural. It's all the environment, the planning, all that stuff, and then emotional. It's what happens at the moment that you have to make a decision, the choice point,
Hmm.
what's going on in your thoughts and emotions, right? But we start with a structural. And I think it's just really useful to, there's a lot that goes into it. In my book, I've got something that I call the SPAR method, right? And it talks about specificity. What am I doing? Where am I doing it? How am I doing it? Like, just drive all ambiguity out of it,
Hmm.
right? P is for prompts. I need to be reminded to do the behavior, right? Because generally we are on a habitual pattern of doing something else. We have to interrupt that in some way. So how are we going to interrupt it, right? So that's the prompts. And then I can't remember what the A is. Oh, A is, I got it. A is for alignment. And alignment is like your environment. So can I, if I'm trying to eat healthy, right? It's a cliche, but right, you just don't have a lot of junk food in the house. Now DoorDash and food delivery has really thrown a wrinkle in this whole thing, right? I mean, it's made it a lot. I just used to be able to tell a client, like, get all the junk food out of your house, and now you can get cookies delivered at 2 a.m. Nonetheless, you want to set up your physical environment, but also environment is who's around you and who's supporting you. And the data is pretty clear that if you have some support, you're much more likely to succeed. So it could be as simple as you ask a friend to text you at the end of each day and ask how you did, right? That's support, right? You post online that you did well today and you get 10 likes. That's support. There's a therapist. There's lots of ways to get support. So alignment is sort of the physical environment. And James Clear talks a lot about this, right? Like, make it easy, make it attractive. His book is a lot focused on this. And it's the people. And then the R is for resilience, which means no matter how well you plan, it's going to go awry. So what are you going to do when it goes awry? So I plan to exercise every morning at 8 a.m. after the kids head off to school. All right. Well, there are going to be days the kids get sick. What do you plan to do then? Your answer might be, look, days that the kids get sick, I just am going to be like, I don't exercise today and I'm not going to feel bad about it. That would be a plan, right? But if you don't have that, what's going to happen is you're going to feel bad. Oh, I didn't do it, right? Versus recognizing couldn't do it. But it could be that, look, I'm not going to have a full hour to drive to the gym and all that. So I'm going to do 20 push-ups and take a 10-minute walk. I say to clients, a little bit of something is better than a lot of nothing. And so R is, how do we plan for when we inevitably get off track? Because you absolutely will. And responding to getting off track in a wise way is really the key to anything that starts to look like a permanent behavior change.
And were you able to apply this in the writing of your book? And I know you speak a little bit about the trans theoretical model as well, and this whole idea of contemplation, planning, and all the rest. Like, how did you set this up to help you write the book?
Well, to sort of, that would be a long conversation if I were to go all the way back to sort of like the pre-contemplation stage. What the trans-theoretical model, which is more appropriately and usefully called the stages of change model, points to is that we tend to think of change as I just all of a sudden do this thing. And what they are saying is it's part of a much bigger window that starts with, pre-contemplation. You're just beginning to have an inkling that there's a problem, but you generally don't think there is. Then contemplation, where you're actually actively thinking about it. And then comes planning, right? Which is kind of what the STAR method is. Then comes action itself, right? And then there's maintenance after that. And so what that points to is that we want to be looking at all those things. So for me, to sort of make it simple for the book, what I would say is I would often go back to what would have come out of a contemplation phase, which is like, why is this important to me? Why does this matter? Why do I want this? Right? You have to be able to draw on that sometimes as motivation. Um, it would have the planning stage, like I knew what days I was going to write. I knew what hours. I spent time organizing and blocking my calendar, like very intentionally, so that there were times and places, and I thought about where I was most likely to write. And then I had my little 30-minute timer. I had my playlist. I had all those things were environmental. Right? Setting the phone on do not disturb, right? Environmental. There were a lot of those sort of things. And then there's the doing it phase, right? Which is what I would say now we shift from the planning and the structural into the emotional. And for me, that was working with those voices of self-doubt generally that said I couldn't do it. So I had to learn to then, how do I work with those voices as they come up? And ideally, the simplest thing is to go, thanks for the information, back to writing, right? That's the best approach. But sometimes that doesn't work. Like they're just too strong. So then I have to actually take them on, and that's where I might be like, okay, you're right. What we're writing is clearly not great. And it's going to get better. You're going to get better as a writer. And if we don't write, that none of that will ever happen. So while self-doubt makes sense, it's not useful here. So that's sort of an example of bringing all those things together in how I dealt with the book.
Yeah, that's really helpful. You know, this whole planning phase, now, this makes me realize like that the thing that you can absolutely guarantee whenever you're trying to change something in your own life or trying to help somebody else make a change is that you're gonna get off track. You're gonna screw up. So if you can count for that in advance and put a strategy in place, okay, if if this happens, then I will do this. Then you're just like, okay, this is part of the plan. Just follow the program. You know?
Absolutely. One of the biggest barriers to long-term behavior change is sort of all or nothing thinking, right? It's either I'm doing this perfectly or I'm not doing it at all. And that is just a disastrous strategy, because something like sobriety, in my case, I was able to one day hit sobriety and maintain that as an absolute. But even for a lot of people, that's a really bad way to think of it. You have to think of it in terms of progress.
Hmm.
Right. One of my favorite stories is this is what a client of mine did. She came up with this idea, but I think it's absolutely genius. In 12-step programs, you count days. You get a coin for 30 days and 60 days and 90 days. Well, she was not yet able to string together continuous sobriety. So what she did was every day that she stayed sober, she put a marble in a bowl. And what we were able to see is that this bowl, she had a lot of marbles in there. So if she had been measuring it all or nothing, she would have felt like I'm not getting anywhere. I'm not getting anywhere. But when we looked at it through the lens of progress, we went, oh, last year you had 39 marbles in that jar. The year before you had like 3 marbles, right? So that's part of when we think that we have to do it right or perfect or not at all. I would say that's one of the biggest causes of people not sticking with something, is that inevitably something happens that gets them off track. It could be They just have a couple bad days. They don't feel good. They go on vacation. Doesn't matter what it is. But the thing in their mind then starts back up with the, like, you can't do it. See, you can't do it. It's very subtle. And then the next thing you know, you're off. So if you start from the perspective of there's no way I'm going to be perfect. James Clear talks about this in his book. He says, never miss twice. If you miss once, that's fine. I think that that's even still too stringent, because lots of times you're going to miss twice even, right? But the key is, when you recognize you're off track, how can you get back on track as quickly as possible with the minimum amount of drama?
Yeah.
Right? The minimum amount of internal drama. Just like, oh yeah, okay, well, I did get off track. I wonder why. What happened? Oh, okay, it's because my mom was in the hospital for a few days. La la la. Okay, I'm back on track. Right? That's what we're after.
Definitely, definitely. So useful. Um, so we spoke there a little bit about all or nothing thinking, and you, I think one a gift that you have, Eric, is this ability to sort of find the middle way.
Yep.
And you have a very unique setup with your partner, for example, that not many people would have arrived at this. I don't know if you want to share that or not. But I'm curious about, is there any way that coaches listening to this can help their clients find the middle way? Because in my experience, the middle way is always the best way, like without fail. And it's very subtle and it can be tricky to find, but when you find it, you're on track.
Yeah, that's a big question. I think what you're talking about is my previous marriage, and we were in a situation. It was a very difficult marriage, and we were in a situation where I just kept. I was locked into, should I stay or should I go? Stay or divorce, right? And those were the only two options that were on the table. And I couldn't, I seemed unable to arrive at the answer for those things, because they both seemed sort of untenable in their own way. Um, so we stumbled into what I like to think of as, like, called a third thing, which is something else. And that's a common idea in decision making theory. You just get more options on the table, right? And so where we ended up was, we decided that we were going to end our marriage as romantic partners, but we were going to stay in the house and stay as a family, because we each brought a child to the marriage, and there were various reasons that was really important, we thought, for their good. And so we're going to stay in the house and co-parent them till they go off to college. But we're going to end the romantic. And so all of a sudden, there was this third thing that I never arrived at when I was only at stay or go. And so with the middle way, we sometimes there's one way of thinking of the middle way, which is you're sort of trying to split the difference down the middle. Right? It's a virtue ethics thought, right? Which is, courage is a middle point between, foolish, rashness, and, being a complete coward. And so in the middle is a place. And for most of our traits, that's what we want. But sometimes the middle way is holding opposites and letting the tension of those resolve into something new. But as far as coaching goes, I think the middle way's most important application is one that we just talked about, which is the client's tendencies to be in, I either am doing it perfect or I'm not doing it, right? And as coaches, I think one of the most important services we can offer is how we respond to and teach clients to respond to their setbacks or their failures or their mistakes. Because learning to do those, learning how to respond to those things, is imperative in the process of making change. And so the middle way there for me is always that sort of, you're not going to be perfect. So for me, when I think about a behavior change, something like exercise, like, my goal is generally to move my body for like 30 minutes every day, at least. Right? What I'm after is about 85 to 90% success at that. because that seems what's reasonable given my life. And if I'm at 90% on that, but I can do that for week after week, month after month, year after year, my health transforms completely. That 10% I'm not getting is unimportant. But a client who's looking at it in a week or two, that 10% looks really big and can be enough to discourage us and get us to quit. So that's the middle way in that. It's like, and you may need to start by saying, hey, for me, if I'm at 75-25, I'm headed in the right direction. Wonderful. That's great. You know, and so I think that's how middle way mostly applies to coaching clients. But I do think that the earlier story about finding a third thing is often another thing that we as coaches can offer people is they come in stuck in a binary. And can we get more options on the table for them? Can we get them brainstorming more options? Because often something new emerges, this third thing, out of these two binaries. And that third thing is often very useful.
For sure. And I know that there's a couple of minutes left here, but before you go,
I've got a couple more minutes than I thought. So not many, but we don't have to end like dead on. So I got a couple minutes.
great. Are there any questions that you find really helpful for getting clients maybe exploring that third way or getting them unstuck in those situations? Are there any things that you found helpful in your practice?
There are coaching questions that I use a lot. I'm trying to think of one that's related specifically to this. I mean, I think it would just be a question around can we brainstorm, 15 other ideas? Like let's just throw out, we have to get to 15 ideas, no matter how dumb they are. Let's do that. Because in that you're generating something new. As far as coaching questions, my fundamental question, I think, for a lot of this stuff is, what am I making this mean? And what else could it mean? Because as humans, we are meaning-making machines. We make meaning out of everything. And how we make that meaning is really important. We could go back to, my client and the marble jar, right? The fact would be she had 21 days sober, then she drank. Then she had 42 days, then she drank. Then she had 3 days, and she drank. That's the fact. Everything after that is meaning. And she could make the meaning be, I'll never get better. See, I'm broken. It's not going to work. Or, gosh, that's a lot of progress. I'm really doing well. I bet I can do better. That's very simple. But we make meaning out of everything all of the time. And so, what am I making this mean, and what else could it mean? And then there's a corollary question to that, which I think is often important, which is, what would be the most useful meaning or interpretation, right? Because they're not neither of those things. If she says I can't seem to stay sober, or there's that's true, as well as she's making progress. Both those things are true. But the one that paints it as progress is a far more useful framing of that. And so I think that those three questions sort of stacked is a way of approaching both behavior change, but also just everything in our lives, every situation, what am I making this mean?
Yeah, it's this. If people just leave this conversation with one insight, I think those three questions are just really valuable. What am I making this mean? What else could it mean? And what's the most useful meaning I could give this situation? Like that's powerful. Eric, it's been an absolute pleasure catching up, and I've enjoyed every minute of this conversation. When is your book out? Do you think? Do you have a date yet, or is that still undecided? Or
Well, right now it's targeted for April of 2026, which seems like a long way off. And yet, as I'm looking at the process of everything that needs to get done between now and then, I'm like, okay, geez, it's getting a little tight.
Okay. You've got an amazing podcast, the one you feed. It's based on a parable of, I'll not butcher it, but around um, basically feeding the good wolf and providing yourself with information that is going to be good for you in the long run and set you up for a really good life. And your podcast is an amazing resource for doing that. You have some amazing guests and great conversations, really in depth. So I really recommend that. Is there anywhere else you would send people online after this conversation?
Well, if you go to oneyoufeed.net, that's ONEYOUFEED.net, you can find the podcast there. You can learn about any programs or workshops that we're running. We've got a few different free resources out there. You can get on our newsletter. It's all there. So you can go there and then choose your own adventure of how you'd like to learn more or engage differently.
Brilliant. All right. Thank you very much, Eric.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.